in this chapter, we'll talk about a history of human anatomy to a certain degree. We'll talk about what anatomy is, how the human body is organized, as well as some of the language of anatomy we use. Anatomy, in a lot of ways, is like learning a language. So we'll talk about what words we use to describe the relationship of different body parts. Okay. So anatomy is really the study of human structure, its form. So I like to think about anatomy as like the geography of the human body. If you think about the human body as maybe the state of Colorado, there's lots of different sub areas within that state, and maybe even sub areas within that. And you can talk about like the roads or blood vessels you might find in a particular area of your body. Okay, and so think about anatomy as sort of like the geography of the human body. And that's part of this class. And so it's the Greek word for to cut up or cut open. And what's nice though is that anatomy or structure often relates to function of a particular thing. So usually the structure of an anatomical component also has a particular function to it, and that's dependent on its structure. Now, physiology is the study of human body processes. Okay, so when you think about how something works in the human body, that's the physiology of it. Okay, so it's the function of that particular part. So anatomy and physiology are interrelated because we'll talk about the structure and functions of different parts. Okay. And that's why these classes are sort of taught in conjunction, if that makes sense. Now, in lab, we'll mostly talk about the anatomy, like the structural components. And in lecture, we'll build on this by talking about the functions of those components. Okay. Now, we can study anatomy in lots of different ways. We can study it in its microscopic form, where you have to use a light microscope or some sort of microscope to see anatomy at its, sort of subvisual level, if that makes sense. We can also study anatomy at the visual level using an unaided eye. We call that gross anatomy. And it doesn't sound like it's like gross, like ew, it's gross anatomy. No, it's not. Gross means like it's a large structure. You can see it with the unaided eye. Like you don't need a microscope to see gross anatomical structures. So most of what we'll talk about in our class then in lab is the gross anatomy. However, we will go over some microscopic anatomy as well. Okay. So we'll talk about what things look like at the microscopic level and the unaided eye level. Okay. So we can also study anatomy in terms of its comparative form. A lot of what we know about the human body has been gleaned from other animals. So we know certain things about how the human brain works by studying how other animal brains work. And this is what I actually did back when I did research at Anschutz. We studied how smell works on rats, to understand better how smell works on mammals in general, including humans. Because apparently it's more, it's more ethical to work on a rat than a human, which I guess kind of makes sense. But it also wasn't fun for me, and I didn't like killing rats every day because that's part of my job was to kill rats and then dissect their brains and then study how their neurons work while their brain tissue was still kind of alive. That wasn't fun. So I didn't like killing things. Like, I'd rather just teach. Sounds awesome. So, but a lot of what we do know about anatomy is comparative. So we study off of animals to know more about what works in humans. We can also study the development of tissues. So we call this developmental anatomy. It's a study of structure. And by understanding how tissues develop, then you can better understand about how they interrelate with their surrounding components. Embryology is also studying developmental changes prior to birth. But how do you think we know anything about how the human develops in an embryo, like in a womb? Can we get in there and watch the whole thing happen? Yeah, kind of. You can put a little camera in there, but it's more invasive. Other animals. Do you guys know what animals we use to study embryology? Or fetal pigs sometimes. Yeah, monkeys sometimes, unfortunately, because they're highly intelligent. But zebrafish actually, their embryos are clear. So what's interesting is that because you can see through the tissues as these things are developing, you can see how the organs develop in real time. So we'll study embryology on zebrafish, which are apparently similar enough embryologically to humans for us to understand how humans develop, which is kind of interesting. If you look at an embryo early on in development, it's indistinguishable from a zebrafish versus a rat versus a human. They all pretty much look identical early on. Now, we can also study regional anatomy, which is basically the study of what you find in a particular region of your body, right? So, what are all the anatomical structures just within this little shoulder or axillary region, okay? That's not the kind of anatomy we're going to study. This is a little bit more advanced, and that would be more like an additional advanced anatomy class, okay? We're going to study systemic anatomy, where we're going to break down the human body into its systems. So we'll talk about the digestive system, so all the components of that. We'll talk about the integumentary system, or skin, okay? So we'll break it down in its systems. We're going to study systemic anatomy. And then surface anatomy we'll get to a little bit in this class, and it's important clinically because we'll study what you can see at the surface and what that implies about what's deep, right? Knowing that there's a artery right here called the radial artery, and it's superficial enough to palpate, you can know that that's where one place you can feel a pulse. So we'll study the surface anatomy too. We have a whole chapter on that we'll get to later on in this class. Now, the human body is actually a pretty amazing universe, if you think about it. First of all, there's trillions of cells that make up your body, okay? And then within those cells, there's, a seemingly uncountable number of atoms as well. So there's basically a universe within us. You guys might hear about people talking about how, we're so small. Like humans are so small. If you think about our existence in relationship to the entire universe, there's billions of other galaxies out there, and we're just a small speck within our own one galaxy. In fact, there's more galaxies than there are grains of sand on Earth, which is even hard to fathom. But so we talk about how small humans are. I don't like that perspective. It's kind of depressing, actually, because it makes you seem like your life's not important or significant or meaningful at all. What I like to think about is there's actually a universe even within us, right? The universe within us are the trillions of cells that work together to make you. And that, to me, is phenomenal and amazing in itself. So we can study anatomy at the atomic level, right? The little fundamental units of matter. We can talk about how our anatomy can boil down to the molecular level, like when atoms come together. Otherwise, when molecules arrange in special orientations, they can actually turn into cells. So these cells are sort of the living units of life. A cell is the fundamental unit of life. And we can talk about when cells come together, how they form tissues. Because a tissue is when multiple cells come together to serve some sort of common goal or function. We could talk about the organs that come about when multiple tissues come together. Actually, an organ is made of at least 2 or more tissue types. So can you guys think of an organ in your body? Yeah, kidneys are actually a pretty amazing organ itself. Those are made of definitely more than 2 tissue types, so we call it an organ. And multiple organs can form an organ system. So the kidneys, although they're an organ, they're part of the organ system we call the urinary system. And there's more to that, right? So the urinary system includes your kidneys, the ureters, your urinary bladder, and your urethra. All that forms a urinary system. So that's when multiple organs can come together to form that organ system, and then many organ systems form an organism, which is you. So it's pretty cool. Can you guys name the organ systems of the human? So we know that we've got the urinary system. What else do we have? Respiratory, digestive, nervous, repro. Neurological system. So nervous system. Did we say that? Endocrine system. Nice. For hormones. That's 7. Or missing others.
The skin one?
Integumentary system. Yeah. Good. What keeps our body in its shape? Skeletal system. Good. Muscular system. Right? Okay. That's pretty much most of them. We might have missed one. Because usually they divide their reproductive systems into 2, like the male and female reproductive systems. So, all right, guys. So these are all the necessary components of life. You might wonder, like, well, how do we define what life is? What's a living organism? How do we differentiate that a pebble isn't living versus a bacterial cell as being alive, right? We have to define what life is, because both the pebble and bacterial cell are both made of matter. But what's so special or different about the matter between a pebble and a bacterial cell? Well, all living things have particular amount of organization, right? There's some organization to that particular thing. You might say, well, the pebble has organization. Maybe it has a crystalline lattice structure within it, and that crystal is organized. Well, if we stopped there, then yes, we would say that pebbles are alive. But that wouldn't make sense, right? So we need further criteria. Well, the second one here is metabolism. Metabolism refers to all of your body's chemical reactions that are occurring at any moment in time. Okay? So metabolism are basically just a bunch of chemical reactions that can occur within a particular structure. So does that pebble have chemical reactions? Yes, but not a significant amount. You know, things can change, like rocks can change, but more slowly over time. Okay? So it wouldn't be appropriate to say that pebbles have metabolism, but bacteria definitely do. They have metabolism. They can actually have lots of chemical reactions. Can pebbles grow and develop? No. Not necessarily. But bacteria definitely can grow and develop, right? Can pebbles respond to their environment? No. And so responsiveness would be how something can receive a stimulus and then have a particular behavior or reaction as a result, okay? Living things can adapt as well. They can adapt and change to their environment, and that way they can actually survive better. Living things can also regulate their internal environment. You know, humans have to regulate their internal environment to maintain what we call homeostasis, which is internal balance, and that's this regulation here. And also, reproduction is an important part of all living things, right? Living thing needs to reproduce. Otherwise, if it doesn't reproduce, the species dies out, if that makes sense. So it's kind of interesting. So these are all the characteristics of all living things. Now, we have 11 organ systems in the human body, and each system has organs that work together to form specific functions. And all these organ systems make up the organism. Okay. So what we're going to do next on these slides, you guys, is go through each of the major organ systems and talk about the major functions of each. So looking at the integumentary system or skin, what are some functions of skin? What do you guys think? Yeah.
Disease and infection.
Protection against, let's say, infectious agents. What else we got? I think that's what you said too, yeah. So protection.
Regulate body temperature.
Yeah, body temperature regulation, right? Because we know if you're hot, you can sweat and cool down. Or we know if you're cold, you can divert blood flow away from skin. Does the skin do anything else? Nice, good. Synthesis of vitamin D. So it has some metabolism there as well. So it controls metabolism by synthesizing a hormone, which is vitamin D3. It's kind of cool. Do you get a lot of absorption through skin? Like, does your skin breathe?
Yes.
That's a really common misconception. I set up a trap for y'all. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to be tricky. It's a really common misconception that your skin breathes, and I think this dates back, I don't know how long ago, but I do know that it was in a movie like Goldfinger or something, where like one of the criminal masterminds like painted these ladies in gold, and they apparently died. They suffocated because their skin was painted gold, like they couldn't breathe. That wouldn't happen, you guys. Like, you could easily paint your skin in gold and just be just fine. In fact, your skin is such a protective barrier. Things don't really cross your skin. Like, do you absorb water through your skin? Don't. Yeah, and we'll learn about this later on when we talk about the skin. And we know you don't absorb water through skin because if that were the case, if you went swimming, you could absorb a lot of water and get really thirsty, right? Well, it doesn't happen. Like, if you go sit in a pool of water, you're still going to need to drink water. Yes?
So what about like pain patches people do?
Exactly.
Your skin is absorbing it.
Good. So there are some things your skin can absorb, but those things that your skin absorbs are typically what we call lipid soluble or fat soluble, and things like steroid hormones. So if you're thinking of like a nicotine patch, that can be loaded in a vesicle that's fat soluble, or if you're taking like some sort of hormone in a patch form, that can be absorbed through skin as well. But your skin really is an absorptive organ. In fact, most of your skin's dead. We'll come back to that later. What about your skeletal system? Like, what's the function of your bones? Support. Gives structure to your body. Protection. Yeah, so it protects internal organs, right? So your ribs protect your lungs and heart, right? Your cranium protects your brain, and your vertebral column protects your spinal cord. But in your pelvis protects some of your pelvic organs as well. So it is involved with protection, absolutely. Like, if you think about it, it's kind of weird. We actually walk around with this helmet on our head. Like, we have a natural bony helmet that protects our brain. And for the most part, it does a pretty good job. Do your bones do anything else?
White blood cells.
Yeah, they produce blood elements. White blood cells, red blood cells, really any kind of blood structural component, which we call formed elements, those come from bones. And they come from marrow. You guys notice there's two types of marrow. We have yellow marrow and red marrow. Well, it's the red marrow in bones. You find some of your long bones here that produces blood cells like red blood cells and white blood cells. So your bones or skeletal system has a function in gas transport through red blood cells and immune function by the production of white blood cells. That's kind of cool. What are bones made of? Yeah, a lot of calcium, a lot of protein. So your bones are also a reservoir or a storage site for minerals like calcium. So let's say if calcium levels get low in your body, there are cells in your bones that can break down the bony structure to release some calcium into your bloodstream. So your bones also function as a reservoir of calcium. That's pretty cool. How about your muscular system? Movement, absolutely. So it helps you move your body around. What else can your muscles move around inside your body? Let me take a sip of coffee. Swallowing, perfect, good. I wasn't trying to give that away, but you're right. As I drank that sip of coffee, drink that coffee. You need muscles to propel whatever you swallow down. So the act of swallowing requires muscles. What about your heart? Well, that's muscle. That pumps blood, so it's also helping to move blood around your body. We'll come back to those functions later. It's involved with some protection. It's also involved with body temperature regulation because if you're cold, you shiver, right? And shivering is the process of rapid muscle contractions, which helps heat your body up. Okay. What about your nervous system? What does it do? Keeps you alive, right? Controls basic life functions. And another way we can word that too would be like it directs the activities of most other organ systems. So if you think about like how your digestive system works, well, it's intimately linked with your nervous system. Or if you think about how your respiratory system works, well, that's intimately linked with your nervous system. So we talk about the nervous system, like your brain, your spinal cord, and the nerves that come off of it. That's involved with really just controlling homeostasis or internal balance within your body. Okay. How about the endocrine system? You guys know what that one is? Hormones, you got it. So endocrine system, which is located throughout your body in different glands, like in your brain, and your thyroid gland, and your heart, your stomach, your kidneys, adrenals, gonads, and even skin releases hormones. Vitamin D is a hormone. These hormones work like the nervous system to control homeostasis or balance within your body. But the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system is the nervous system is really rapid acting. Like your nerves can carry electrical impulses really quickly to their target tissue. Whereas the endocrine system releases hormones into your bloodstream which get to their target much more slowly. Okay? But these two work together to control internal balance or homeostasis in your body. Okay? How about the cardiovascular system? Yeah, good. Distribution of nutrients, right? Or elimination of wastes, because you can carry wastes from a tissue to your kidneys to be eliminated, right? So what are some nutrients your blood might transport? Yeah, absolutely. Gases like oxygen. Yep. Or wastes like carbon dioxide. So blood can transport that. What if I told you guys that it's also involved with body temperature regulation? That's a weird one. How is your cardiovascular system involved with body temperature regulation?
Maybe if your blood's moving like slower than you're colder.
Yeah, it relates to blood flow and where that blood's flowing. So where do you think your body's the warmest? On your skin or internal organs? Internal organs. So then what warms up your skin if you're not like in sunshine? Blood. Yeah, right. So blood from your internal organs, where it's hotter, is being carried to your skin, and that warms up these tissues, right? Or what if you're exercising and your muscles get really hot because they're releasing a lot of heat from so much activity? How do you lose that heat from your body? You can sweat, right? Or you can also increase blood flow to skin to help dissipate that heat. So the cardiovascular system is also involved with body temperature regulation because you can alter, blood carries heat. You can alter where that blood flows to better control your body temperature. So it's pretty cool. Do you guys know this one? The lymphatic system? Has anyone heard of this one before? What do you guys know about lymph? Good. Immune function? What are you going to say too?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we know it's involved with your immune system. Do you guys know what it is, the lymphatic system? It's a series of tubes. Like the cardiovascular system, it's a series of tiny little channels you find in your tissues that go all throughout your body and basically bring excess fluid from your tissues back to your bloodstream. Okay? So let's say, let's think about in your feet. There's water that gets forced out of your blood vessels into the tissues of your feet. Well, how does that water get back into your bloodstream? Well, your lymphatic system can pick that up, carry that lymphatic or excess fluid up your leg, up your abdominal cavity, and then dump that fluid back into your bloodstream. So lymph is highly linked with the immune system as well as helping to return excess fluids back to your bloodstream. Have you guys ever seen someone with edema? Like lymphedema, where maybe their hand is really swollen? That's going to be where you have an accumulation of a lot of water or fluid in that tissue. Well, your lymphatic system can help to reduce this swelling by helping to carry that excess fluid away. Okay. We'll come back to this more so in A&P too. What about your respiratory system? What's that involved with? I'm sorry? Oxygen distribution. So absorption of oxygen from our atmosphere. Our bodies need oxygen to make ATP. So we need to inhale and absorb a tremendous amount of oxygen. What else does our respiratory system do for us? Nice. Expels wastes like carbon dioxide. So CO2 is a waste, and if it builds up in your bloodstream, it forms an acid called carbonic acid. If you don't eliminate CO2 from your bloodstream, basically your blood will acidify so much that it could kill you. In fact, I just watched the new what's that Tom Cruise series of movies where he's like a spy? Mission Impossible. I just watched the movie last night, you guys. I don't remember the name. So I watched the new Mission Impossible last night. There's a scene where he's like underwater for like 4 minutes. And I was thinking, oh man, that would be horrible. That would be horrible. I can't tell you anything more. I'm not gonna do a spoiler alert. But it actually was a pretty good movie. It got a 7.5 on IMDb, which is actually pretty good. So the respiratory system also helps to eliminate certain wastes like CO2. What else does your respiratory system do for you? So absorbs oxygen, eliminates wastes. Smell, right? Olfaction, right? You can't really smell very well unless you can inhale, right? How about talking? Can you talk if you can't expel air? No, exactly. The whole process of talking requires, at least me right now, as I'm talking, to and breathe air out across my vocal cords to speak, to produce sound, words, right? So the respiratory system is also involved with producing speech or sounds. It's kind of cool. How about your digestive system? Absorbs nutrients. Good. So from mouth to anus, it's one big old long tube that's involved in absorbing and processing nutrients. And you can also eliminate some wastes through feces. So certain wastes are incorporated into feces, so that's how they're eliminated from your body. Okay. Do you guys know that the inside of the digestive system is actually technically outside of your body? Yeah. Isn't that weird? So if you think about like yourself inside of the stomach, would you be inside of the body? It's funky. If you found yourself on the inside of the stomach, would you be inside someone's body or outside? It's technically outside. What? How does that work? Well, if the digestive system is just a tube from mouth to anus, and if you go down that tube, you're actually never really getting into the body. You're staying in the outside environment. It's just a tube going down your whole through your body. But the inside of that tube is actually technically the outside of your body, which is funky. But if you think about it, it makes sense because what do you find in your digestive tract? Well, a lot of enzymes that can hurt your tissues, a lot of bacteria that could kill you, and other wastes and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. Think about like the digestive system is actually technically the outside of your body. How about the urinary system? Do you guys know what that does? Elimination of excess water, so urination, right? Why might you want to help eliminate too much water? What's the point of that? Good, electrolyte balance. So the kidneys also regulate electrolyte balance like potassium, sodium, and other electrolytes. Good. What if I told you guys too, another waste you can eliminate too? What if I told you guys too, though, that blood volume, or water in your blood, correlates with blood pressure. So your kidneys also regulate blood pressure. So that if you have too much water in your body, your blood pressure could be too high. And so your kidneys then can help to eliminate more water and thereby reduce your blood pressure. So kidneys are also involved with blood pressure regulation. Okay. Kidneys also release a hormone called erythropoietin, and they stimulate the production of red blood cells. So what if I told you guys that the kidneys also allow you to help transport oxygen? That's kind of funky. How many of this is new to y'all? Some of it's kind of weird, right? Yeah. I mean, who would have thought the kidneys release a hormone that stimulates red blood cell growth? So what you find is there's a lot of interconnectedness here. Okay. And then there's the reproductive systems. We know what that's for, right? Are the reproductive systems necessary for keeping you alive? No. They're just there for reproduction. And fun, I suppose. So we're going to move on next, you guys, to talk about the precise language of anatomy. And we're going to start here with what we call the anatomical position. You might wonder, what is this anatomical position? Well, it's this, okay? There's no picture here yet, but it's this. So, standing upright, palms facing forward, arms slightly at your side, feet side to side. That's the anatomical position. You might wonder, why do we have an anatomical position? Well, it's the standard position that we reference every single body part against. If you didn't have an anatomical position, it would be really difficult to describe the relationship of different body parts. So you have to have a standard position, but which, by the way, was defined by Leonardo da Vinci. You guys ever seen the Vitruvian Man, where it's like this? The Leonardo da Vinci picture, and it's like a circle. He's got his arms like that. That's where the anatomical position came from. But it's basically just that standard position there. So that's something you want to put in your post lab, right? You want to take a picture of someone in the anatomical position because that was the first structure or term on your introduction lab guide. So you want to take a picture of someone like this. It could be me or anybody.
So we shouldn't just define it, we can do a picture too.
Yeah, do a picture, and you could do a definition too if you want. In fact, your book won't say this, by the way, but the correct anatomical definition or position for males is also an erect penis. I know. But you don't find this in like American anatomy textbooks because apparently that would be too offensive, right? If you had a picture of someone standing there with like an erect penis, like I guess that would be like too offensive for people. So they don't put that in the textbook and they sort of gloss over that history. Although when it was first defined, they had the erect penis as the standard anatomical position. So, so if I told you guys to assume the anatomical position, yeah, all you need to do is this. Okay. Oh, it's funny. So here it is, right? And obviously that can't happen if you're female. There's no erect penis there, right? So that's not even relevant. But we see the anatomical position here. And don't get naked for your pictures, you guys. Obviously, please wear clothes. I don't want to get in trouble. There's been times in the past where things got a little iffy, like, ooh, I don't know, it's like on this borderline, like, appropriate. There's been times where I've had students, like, in bikinis and stuff, like, take pictures, and they put that in their lab notebook. I'm like, if I get caught with this, I'm in so much trouble. So, don't do that, you guys. Just be fully clothed. That works just totally fine. So, standing upright, feet parallel on the floor, head level, looking forward, arms to the side, palms facing forward, thumbs pointing away from your body, right? That's the anatomical position. Now, what we can do next then is talk about certain things like sections and planes. Sections are cuts or slices through a structure, and a plane is an imaginary sort of field through the body, okay? So a section is like, if I ask you guys to make a section of a sheep brain, which by the way we'll be doing later, we'll be cutting up sheep brains later in this class. If I ask you guys to make a section of the sheep brain, you would physically or literally cut the brain in that section, okay? That's a physical cut. A plane is an imaginary flat surface or field through the body. It's imaginary. It's not really there, but it's important as a reference point for certain terms, okay? So the anatomical planes, we have these four main planes. We got the oblique plane, transverse plane, mid-sagittal plane, and the coronal plane. I think I went out of order. So what's the coronal plane? That's the first one up top.
Anterior and posterior.
Good. It separates anterior versus posterior. In fact, coronal means crown. So the coronal plane is like this, like a crown, and it's an imaginary slice that would separate your body into anterior and posterior halves. Okay, that's the coronal plane. So if you're ahead of the coronal plane, like right here, that's anterior. If you're behind the coronal plane, that's posterior. Okay, it's also called the frontal plane. Either of those is fine. Okay, and we'll see a picture of this here pretty soon. The transverse plane, also called the horizontal plane, cuts your body like this, transversely, in half, exactly. Perfect. So it cuts the body into superior and inferior halves. So if you're ahead, or sort of superior, or above the transverse plane, that would be superior. If you're below the transverse plane, then it's inferior. Okay? In fact, the transverse plane can be any place on your body, like this. You'll see that pictures usually show it right here, but it could be here. It could be here. Here. Just anywhere in this direction, up and down your body. Okay? How about the mid-sagittal plane? Well, the mid-sagittal plane, it goes right down the midline. Okay? In fact, I like to think about the mid-sagittal plane as the line of symmetry. Like, have you guys ever, I don't know why I've ever experienced this or done this before, but like, if you find a wall that has a mirror on it, and if you stand next to that mirror and kind of get in the side of it, you can sort of superimpose yourself on that mirror, right? So although only half of your body is exposed to the mirror, it looks like you have a full body on that mirror. You guys know what I'm talking about? If you find that line, right in the middle, where the mirror image would look like it's your whole full body, that would be the mid-sagittal line. So the mid-sagittal line is the median line here. It goes right down the midline of your body. Okay? Now the mid-sagittal plane defines medial versus lateral. If something's closer to the mid-sagittal line, it's called medial. If it's farther from the mid-sagittal line, it's called lateral. Okay? So I'll give you guys an example. Your acromion here is lateral to your sternum, because your sternum is right on the mid-sagittal line, and your acromion, or tip of your shoulder, is farther away from the mid-sagittal line. Okay? Or your thumbs, pollex, is lateral to your palm, or palmar region. Yeah, makes sense. So what about the oblique plane? Oblique is actually going to be sort of an angle. So this is the oblique plane. It doesn't really define any terms necessarily, but some sections are in the oblique plane. But these are the four main ones that we'll use. Okay. So which plane separates your body into equal right and left halves? Mid-sagittal. Good. And which plane separates your body into upper and lower portions? Transverse. Good. Which plane separates your body into front and back portions? Coronal. Good. And then what about the side plane? Yeah. And good. Someone said frontal, and frontal is also another word for coronal. So very good. All right, guys. So what does this look like? Well, we see here on this slide, what would the red one be? Mid-sagittal. Good. How about the green one? Transverse. And the blue one? Coronal. Good. And this one, it does not have the oblique, but oblique would be sort of a sideways plane here. Okay. So you definitely want to know those planes, and we'll come back to those other directional terms here in a little bit in terms of what they define or how you use them. Now, some examples of these planes would be like, you can look at an organ in different planes, right? Like if you look at an organ in its sagittal plane, it'll look like a circle here. If you look at the same organ in the transverse plane, it might be kind of oval. Or if you look at other sections here, they can have different shapes. And so we'll look at some cross-sectional anatomy later on in class. So for some of the organs, we'll actually look at them in this sort of structure. So for instance, we might look at the structure of the stomach in its section here, right? So we'll, at a particular plane, when we cut a section, and then look at that organ in that particular orientation. So we'll look at these, kinds of structures later. Now, one thing we wanted to move on to next, you guys, and this is really important to get down soon, is the anatomical directional terms. Okay, these anatomical directional terms. This is the precise language of human anatomy, and this is how we describe the relationship of different parts. Okay, so what was the plane that went right down the midline? Mid-sagittal. Do you guys know what it's called if it's not right in the midline? Like, what if it's here? Just sagittal, right? So this would be sagittal. This would be sagittal, but right in the midline is mid-sagittal. You can also call this parasagittal, but sagittal works too. Okay? So mid-sagittal helps define medial versus lateral. Medial means closer to the mid-sagittal line. Lateral means farther from the mid-sagittal line. So can you guys think of any examples of structures that are like medial or lateral? What's a medial structure? If it's closer to the mid-sagittal line
The inside of your knee,
versus,
the outside of your knee.
yeah, perfect. I like that. Yeah. So think about like let's say like the very inside of your knee versus the outside of your knee would be more medial. Good. Or what about if it's the mid-sagittal plane right here, you guys? What's something that's right on the mid-sagittal line? Yeah, the sternum is right on the mid-sagittal line, so that's definitely medial. How about belly button, umbilicus? That's medial, right? Or pubis. Okay. What are some lateral structures? If I'm in the anatomic position. Yeah, hips are more lateral to the umbilicus. Yeah, shoulder is more lateral to the sternum. Does it make sense? Ears are lateral to the nose, right? So how about, I'll tell you, this little part right here, guys, is called the glabella. The glabella, which is between your eyebrows, is what to your brow line or supraorbital ridge? Medial, right. The glabella will be medial to the supraorbital ridge. Very good. Okay. Is everyone cool in those terms? All right. And the best way to get these down, you guys, is just practice them. The more you use them, the more it'll make sense. How about the transverse plane? This defines superior versus inferior. Okay. If something is above the transverse plane, it's superior. If it's below the transverse plane, then it's inferior. So if this is the transverse plane right here, you guys, my chin or mentis would be what to my mouth or oris? Be inferior. The mentis or chin is inferior to the mouth or oris, right? Or how about my forehead here or frontal region is what to my nose or nasal region? Superior. Good. Or how about my sternum is what to my umbilicus? Superior. Good. Or how about the scapular region here is what to the lumbar region? Superior. Good. Does that making sense? You're following? All right. Awesome. So what about anterior versus posterior? Well, that's defined by the coronal or frontal plane. Good. So if something is ahead of the frontal or coronal plane, that's anterior. If it's behind it, it's posterior. So can you guys think of any examples of structures that are maybe anterior or posterior? Yeah, good. So like the sort of the stomach area is anterior to the back here, right? How about the occipital region is what to the nasal region? Posterior. Good. How about the sternal region is what to the scapular region? Anterior. Good. Now, what you'll find, though, is that it's not always one or the other. Okay, you can find that you can have a mixture of these words. So I'll give you guys an example. My ear is what to my mouth? So the auricular region is what to the oral region? It's a little posterior. It's a little superior. And lateral. Good. So you can say posterior, superior, and lateral to the mouth. I know. So that sounds funky, but we can use those words to kind of get us in a particular direction, right? It's almost like saying, north, south, west, that kind of stuff. So what's proximal versus distal? Well, these words are more appropriate for limbs, okay? So if you notice, I've been avoiding my limbs when I use these examples. I'm kind of using more of the trunk area or axillary area. What about limbs? Well, proximal and distal. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. I like to think about that the same way too. So distal is more distant from the attachment point of that limb. Proximo means first. Proximal means closer to, right? Like a proximity, close proximity, is closer to the attachment point of that limb. So your wrist or carpal region is what to the antecubital region? Distal, right? Or how about the olecranon or elbow here? Olecranon region is what to the axillary region? Also distal. Good. Or how about your tarsal region or ankle is what to your popliteal region? Or also distal. Good. How about the axillary region is what to your brachial region? Proximal. Good. So if it's closer to the attachment point of that limb, it's proximal. If it's farther from the attachment point of the limb, it's distal. Make sense? Now, you can find these words used in other ways, too. Sometimes you find proximal distal used in blood vessels. Like if a blood vessel is closer to the heart, it's more proximal. Or if it's farther from the heart, it's more distal. But as far as AMP1 is concerned, you guys, we'll talk about this with respect to limbs for now, okay? So you want to be able to use these words. Again, this is in your lab guide, right? So you want to have a picture or some definitions of these particular structures, right? So the way I'd set this up, and I think your book does it a similar way too, is let's say if you had someone in the anatomical position, you can do some arrows to show these directions, right? What if you had an arrow pointing this way on an arm? Distal, right? Or this way? Proximal, right? Or how about an arrow pointing this way? Lateral, right? Yeah, you could say oblique if it was kind of going sideways, right? Or how about an arrow pointing this way? Medial. How about this way? Superior, inferior. Make sense? Yeah, you could do it that way. I mean, whatever makes sense to y'all. In fact, that's actually what this next slide shows. I forgot that was on the next slide. I guess I just like using my hands to point at stuff. So you can see anterior versus posterior, superior versus inferior. By the way, why is this not the correct anatomical position? You're right. I like that. His thumbs aren't pointing out. Totally. Actually, you're right. That is correct. You know, but he's also not erect, you guys. Like I told you, they're not going to show an erect penis. And, you know, that is the correct definition. So, I just think it would be hilarious if they did. Like, welcome to anatomy, right? First lecture. A big old howdy do. Oh, that's funny. Now, this table here, you guys, shows the definitions of all those terms we just talked about. Okay. There's some other terms on here that we haven't mentioned yet. They're good to know, but I think we can just move on. You guys can look at them later. Things like ipsilateral versus contralateral. We'll come back to that. Ipsilateral means same side. Contralateral means opposite sides of the body. So there's other directional terms that you guys can get a sense of. Oh, actually, one thing that's important before we move on: deep versus superficial. If something's superficial, it's closer to the skin. If it's deep, it's farther from the skin. So can you guys give me some examples of like a structure that's deep or superficial? Yeah. Digestive system is deep to the skin. Yeah. Or what about bones to muscle? Bones are deep to muscle. Muscle is what to bone? Superficial. Good. And then skin is what to muscle? Superficial. Good. All right. Cool, guys. Yeah, a lot of these actually just make a lot of sense, and it's just very intuitive. I know it looks like a lot, but it's fairly straightforward. So we can also talk about anatomy in its regional form, too. So you guys may have noticed that while I was pointing at these structures, I gave different names, right? You may have noticed I called this the acromion, or the axilla, or the brachium, or antebrachium, or the carpal region, right? Or the digits, or the pollex. I mentioned pollex. Or this is one of my favorite too, you guys. Behind the knee is the popliteal region. I like to say that because when I was studying, it reminded me of like Mary Poppins. So I was thinking like the popliteal region right here is the little area behind your knee. Like we call this the armpit, right? And I was always, before I took anatomy, I'm like, what the heck is this called? Like, is it the knee pit? No, it's the popliteal region. So now you guys won't forget that. So what this table shows are all of those structures. So the anatomical word with the sort of the common word or layman's word, right? We want to learn the anatomical words because this is the type of language that we use in healthcare and anatomy in general. Okay. So I've got a picture of this somewhere. These human body regions. There's a picture in your textbook where all of these are labeled, and you can see these things. A lot of these, I'm sure you guys know already, right? Like what's the eye called? Like this ocular region. Good. How about the lips, mouth area? Oral area. Good. Or about the neck? Do you guys know one? Cervical. Yep. Cervical region. How about the forehead? Frontal. Yep. There's some other weird ones though. You guys may not be familiar with. Like I said, like the popliteal region, right? Or you know other weird ones too. Like the ears are called the auricles. auricles. So the auricles. Okay. Other weird ones would be like the acromion, right here. The point of your shoulder is the acromion. Now, many of these are named for the structures that are deeper. So when you learn these words and you learn them well, it's going to help you tremendously with future anatomy. Because if you know that this part of your body is called the acromion, once we get to bones in a couple weeks, the part of the bone right here is called the acromion process. It's kind of cool. Or when we go to vessels in AMP2, if you know that this part of your body is called the popliteal region, the vessels back there are the popliteal artery and vein. And so they're named for the structures that are deeper, and so it actually makes a lot of sense. So if you learn these well and get a good foundation, you guys, it's going to make your life a lot easier in the future. So definitely check these out. And these are also in your lab guide. Last but not least, you guys, the body cavities. So when you think of a body cavity, what comes to your mind? Like when they say you're going to get a cavity search. Yeah, some sort of hole or space in your body, right?
I was gonna say jail.
What's that?
I was gonna say jail, but
Jail, yeah. So there's two major body cavities, you guys. We have the posterior body cavity and the ventral body cavity. The posterior body cavity includes your cranial cavity and vertebral cavity. So cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, that's your posterior body cavity. And those contain your brain and spinal cord, respectively. And the ventral body cavity, or anterior body cavity, by the way, ventral means belly side. So ventral means belly side. So the ventral body cavity, or anterior, contains your thoracic cavity and abdominopelvic cavities. Okay. Now, there are subcavities within those, though. Do you guys know what you find in the thoracic cavity? Lungs, either lung and your heart right in the middle. Good. And there's more in there, but that's the gist, right? How about the abdominopelvic cavity? Yeah, a lot of guts, right? Yeah, a lot of digestive structures, guts, and that kind of stuff. In the pelvic cavity, bladder, reproductive structures too. So what does this look like? Well, back here we have the cranial cavity and vertebral cavity. So what body cavity is that form?
oh, your nervous system.
Well, your nervous system's in that, but there's a name for this whole body cavity. It's got the cranium and the spinal cavity. Posterior body cavity. You call it the posterior aspect. That's fine too. Otherwise, the posterior body cavity contains your cranium and vertebral cavity. And then we have our thoracic cavity and the ventral body cavity and abdominopelvic here. So if you look at the thoracic cavity, what separates it from the abdominal cavity? Like, why aren't these continuous? Yeah, the respiratory diaphragm, exactly. So respiratory diaphragm is what goes across here, and it separates the thoracic from the abdominopelvic cavities. Now, the thoracic cavity has several subcavities within it. Okay. Now, each lung you find in a pleural cavity. Okay, so the pleura are the cavities that the lungs sit within. The heart you find within the mediastinum cavity, the mediastinal cavity. That's the heart. Okay, that's called the pericardial cavity. And there's the superior mediastinal cavity, which contains the thymus, esophagus, and trachea. Okay, do you guys know what the thymus is? We'll learn about it in AP2, but it's involved with your immune system. So when your immune system is developing, there's a thymus there.
And that's in what cavity?
The mediastinum.
Oh.
Yeah. And I know this shows that the pericardial cavity is being separate, you guys. And I don't know why your book does this, but it turns out technically there's four parts to the mediastinal cavity, but there's a superior and inferior mediastinum. Okay. Now your book just says that this is the pericardial cavity and not part of the mediastinum, but it technically is part of it. You might come across that. I'm just trying to tell you guys that in case you're getting confused. So what separates the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities again? Respiratory diaphragm. Good. And then in the abdominal cavity, you find a lot of your guts, right? So what do you find in here? Like liver. Good. What about like small intestine, large intestine, spleen, stomach, pancreas, kidneys, gallbladder. I'm pointing out imaginary structures, but you guys know what I'm saying. They're all in there. Okay. Now, what about in the pelvic cavity? Urinary bladder, internal reproductive structures, or organs, and the rectum. So the very end of your large intestine. Okay? That's what's in your pelvic cavity. And those are separated by a little bit of tissue that we'll get to later. I won't talk about it yet. Okay? Now, you might wonder, well, what separates the lungs from the heart? Like, you'd think that the lungs and the heart are just side by side. And they are, but they're separated by specific tissues called serous membrane. I think that's coming up next, you guys. Yeah. So serous membrane, you guys, is a very thin membrane, and it's a double membrane. And a membrane just means that you can have a little bit of things moving across some tissue. Okay. Now, a serous membrane has two main layers, a parietal layer and a visceral layer. And it's structured a lot like a fist sticking in a water balloon. I know it sounds weird, but I'll show you guys a picture here, I believe, next. So let's just focus up here in the top left first. So looking at the top left here, do you guys notice how there's this fist and it's protruding into the water balloon there? Okay. Now the layer of tissue that directly surrounds that fist. By the way, is that fist wet?
No.
No. It's sort of like you're sticking a fist into the water side of the water balloon, but you're not actually getting it inside the water balloon, right? So that layer of water balloon that's directly around the fist is called the visceral layer of serous membrane. And the layer of water balloon that's outside of that is the parietal layer of serous membrane, okay? So what if you started moving your fist around in there? Would you get a lot of friction? No. There's those two layers are separated by a fluid-filled space. So why would you want that around your heart? Yeah, it moves a lot. Your heart beats, many numbers of times every minute, possibly even several times a second. And if it's moving around that much, you don't want it to rub up against nearby tissues. So the heart is surrounded by its own serous membrane. And so what's the layer of serous membrane directly around the heart called? The visceral layer. Good. And the layer of serous membrane that's around the heart but not directly touching it. The parietal layer. Good. So by the way, the lungs have that too. So the lungs have a visceral layer and a parietal layer. Now these serous membranes have specific names though. So the name of the serous membrane around the heart is called pericardium. Hence the pericardial cavity. Because the heart sits in that cavity which is made by serous membrane. So the name for the visceral layer of serous membrane in the heart is the visceral pericardium. Okay, and then you have the parietal pericardium. Okay. And then the lungs you find in the pleural cavities. Okay, so each lung is within a pleural cavity, and the layer of serous membrane around the lung is the visceral pleural, and around outside of that is the parietal pleural. And you guys know around a lot of your digestive organs, it's called the peritoneum. Like, have you guys heard of an intraperitoneal injection before, or IP injection? First of all, it sounds terrifying because you're talking about sticking a needle into your abdominal cavity. I used to administer these to rats back in the day. It was not fun. Like, remember I said I had to kill rats? Well, you had to anesthetize them. So the way you anesthetize them is, while they're still awake. And you kind of get them hazy with a little bit of something like, it's kind of like chloroform. And then while they're kind of debilitated, I'd stick them with a needle and inject them with that anesthetic. Then do my thing. The first time I did that, you guys, I pretty much cried. I'm not gonna lie, because it was so gruesome. Because I'm talking about how once the rat was asleep, I'd pin it back on a board, and I'd take off its chest cavity here, and then while its heart was still beating, I'd just stick a needle in its heart to inject formaldehyde into its bloodstream, and that formaldehyde then would get to its brain and then fix the brain tissue, and the heart would actually pump it there. I know, right? It's traumatic. I feel like I still have nightmares about this. Yeah. So, I don't know. Every time I see a rat, I just think, I'm sorry. If there's a rat hell, I'll probably go there and they'll get their revenge on me, right? So the peritoneum here, you guys, it's actually serous membrane you find around your guts. Think of what digestive organs you think move a lot. Absolutely. Small intestine, large intestine, those move quite a bit. Stomach does. Every time you hear that like grumbling in your stomach, that's the organs moving. If they weren't lubricated by a serous membrane, you get a lot of friction, and that could lead to damage. So the peritoneum is what surrounds your digestive organs there. And then these slides just basically go through what we just talked about, you guys. So, you have the heart within a pericardial cavity. We talked about that. You got the lungs within the pleural cavity. We talked about this as well. You have your digestive organs in the abdominal cavity, and those are surrounded by the peritoneum. And again, you have the parietal and visceral layer of peritoneum. Now, just to wrap up this lecture, you guys, we have abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. The regions give us 9 regions here, you guys, and they're named for just basically their location. And what we see here then is we have the right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, epigastric, lumbar, umbilical, right, left lumbar, iliac, hypogastric, other iliac. So hypochondriac, you guys heard before, right? You think of that as usually as the condition where people think they have an illness that they don't really have. But this translates differently in anatomy. So hypo is the root for below. Chondro is the root for cartilage. So hypochondriac actually means below cartilage. And this is the costal cartilage of your ribs right here. Like, I know it feels like bones, but that's actually cartilage right there. So the hypochondriac regions are right here. Okay? And then epi means nearby or surrounding. So epigastric is our nearby or surrounding the stomach, which is kind of this area. All right? Do you have a question? No? Okay. And then the umbilical region, you guys, right on your umbilicus. That makes sense. And then lumbar, we know that this is your lumbar region of your spine. So the lumbar regions are just right here, just lateral to the umbilicus. And then the iliac regions you find next to your iliac bones. So you have the right and left iliac regions. And then you have the hypogastric, which is kind of like the pubic area. Okay. Now, what I want you guys to know are the organs contained within each. So what do you guys think you find in the epigastric region? It's right here. Stomach, absolutely. Anything else? Probably a little bit of esophagus, right? Because the esophagus has to go down and meet the stomach too. Very good. A little bit of liver is in there too. A little bit of pancreas there as well. You can't see it because it's deep to that. Okay. In fact, this is the stomach right here. This is the liver. So a lot of it's liver. How about the right hypochondriac region? If it's up in here, what's that? Most of the liver. And actually, it won't be a lung because this is actually going to be in the abdominal cavity. The lung's up here in the thoracic cavity. So what about the umbilical region around your belly button? Mostly small intestine, exactly. How about the lumbar regions? Kidneys and large intestines. Okay. Gallbladder is going to be in the a little bit of hypochondriac, maybe kind of epigastric too. It's sort of near this convergence, although lumbar seems to be there as well. I won't test you guys now. It's kind of nearby the convergence there. How about left hypochondriac? What would you guys find up in here? Yeah, the heart's up here actually. Because remember, these are just abdominal structures. Parts of the stomach, good. So the fundus of the stomach's up there. The spleen. How many spleens do you have? One, and it's found right there in the left hypochondriac region. Good. And then what about the right iliac region? Well, you got your vermiform appendix is there. So the appendix is down low right there. And then the hypogastric region, you guys, think of your pelvic organs. So bladder, rectum, internal reproductive structures like the uterus. Okay. So those are the regions. And then these are the quadrants. The quadrants are a little easier because there's only 4 of them. And the way that we determine what the abdominopelvic quadrants are is that you have these lines that intersect right at the umbilicus. So you have a mid-sagittal line and a transverse line. They intersect at the belly button or umbilicus. If it's in this particular quadrant, that's the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. And then I want you guys to know what organs you find within each. Okay, and you guys can work on this in lab too.